Hey Reddit, when did your "something's not right here" gut feeling ever save you? I used to just drive around country roads when I would feel stressed out or sad, as a way to just get away and listen to music. One evening, I was driving with my best friend in the car, and we're on a gravel road that has a huge hill. We were driving towards the sunset, but it was winter, and the light was fading fast. As the car started down the hill, I had this moment where I thought to myself, my brights should be on, and I flicked them on, and at the bottom of this super steep hill stood 6 deer on the road. I slammed on the brakes, and the car turned sideways and skidded to a stop like 4 feet from the deer. Those stupid deer didn't even move. They just stared into the passenger side of my car, and my best friend pointed at them and said, "Hey dear." The car was fine, we were fine, and Bambi was all good. I don't drive around like that anymore. My mom and her entire family were saved from dying from carbon monoxide poisoning by her dad. He left for work, got a weird feeling, and drove back home. Everyone in the house was unconscious, and they had to drag or carry them all outside one by one. They all survived. My sister, since she was about 5, was always obsessed with tsunamis, and would always ask my dad every night before we went to sleep if there would be a tsunami that night. We lived on a beach. About 5 years later, when our family was holidaying in Samoa, an earthquake struck at about 6 a.m. It was only a dull, low rumble, but went on for over a minute. Everyone at the resort woke up and went outside for a few minutes, then went back to bed. My sister, having been obsessed with tsunamis, ran down to look at the water and noticed the sea going out and saved a lot of lives, including my own. There was about a minute from her noticing till the tsunami hit. Luckily for us, there was a cliff right behind the resort. If not, a lot more people would have been killed. So something like a gut feeling 5 years in the making. Not me, but my science teacher. When she was a teenager, she was standing near some lights at a pedestrian crossing with her and her friend. Very chill, but out of nowhere, she had this gut feeling that both of them had to move. They moved just a couple meters away, and the next moment a car had hit another car and had hit one of the street electricity utility poles, and it had fallen over and exploded. A minor explosion enough distance away that it didn't hurt the girls, exactly where they were. One of the wires had also snapped and hit exactly where they were standing as well. They basically were in a scene of car wreckage and snapped wires and electricity explosions and the pole collapse. Just really insane. If the pole had missed them, the wire would have hit them, and if not that, then most likely the cars. That gut feeling of moving away saved both of them. I remember this story so clearly from a high school science class because it was such a what the frick. Pity I only paid attention to these things and not actually the science. I went to the hospital with shortness of breath and my heart racing. They did a chest x-ray, blood tests for blood clots, ECG, and a few other tests, but all came back normal. After observing me overnight, everything still looked good. Oxygen saturation was perfect, my heart rate was still a bit elevated, but nothing too crazy. And it seemed it was likely leftover symptoms from a bad virus that I'd had a week or so earlier. The ER doctor asked me how I would feel if they sent me home, and I just had a bad feeling about it. I told him as such, and that I had no real basis for it, except that I just felt off about it. He said, "Fair enough, let's try one more test, and if it comes back negative, then we'll send you up to general medicine and see if they can track something down." That test was a VQ scan, and found despite all other tests showing no results for blood clots, that I actually had a whole bunch of them in both lungs. I ended up with a diagnosis of unprovoked bilateral pulmonary embolisms and am on blood thinners for life. Super grateful for the bad feeling and the ER doctor who was willing to listen to it. When I was about 10 years old, I was going to the beach with my older sister, her friends, and their parents. They had a van that was open in the back. Think white creepy van, no seats. The other friends of my sister's friends took turns sitting on the father's lap when he asked if they wanted to steer the van. He then asked me and my gut said, "No, this man is creepy as frick." The look in his eyes sent shivers down my spine. Once we got to the beach, I forgot all about the creepy guy and focused on fun. Fast forward several months later, my sister's friends asked if my sister wanted to sleep over. She refused, and my mom and I were baffled as to why she didn't want to go. We kept encouraging her to. She soon broke down in tears and told her that one night their father had touched her. The van incident and feelings came flying back to me. I wish I had not forgotten my gut feeling and shared it with my mother and sister before anything happened to my sister. Sometimes I still feel guilty over it. That was over 30 years ago. I don't remember what happened to the guy. I just remember a state vehicle at my house a lot afterwards. No one ever talked about it again, and I never asked. I was learning violin when I was about 10. from an instructor at my local music shop. I got the weirdest feeling from him, even though he didn't do anything out of the ordinary. I wanted to vomit every time I looked at him, especially his hands. After 4 lessons, I told my parents that I had a terrible feeling about him, and I never wanted to go back. Luckily, they listened and didn't make me ever go to him again. A few years later, he was arrested for touching multiple students. I have no idea how I knew something was off. He never did or said anything, but I just felt it. Creds to my dad for this one. Back in 2011, my dad and I were driving down the country for New Year's Eve. Suddenly he goes quiet, kind of starts breathing slow and steady, and tells me to look up the road. He was so calm and focused. I look up and see a car spinning in the middle of the freeway, ramping up speed and knocking cars off the road. This is Scandinavian winter, pretty much on ice. So my dad proceeds to accelerate towards the guy spinning, which didn't even occur to me as weird. He was just so calm, which made me calm. The car hits us on my dad's side. Half a second earlier, my dad turned slightly right, which was just enough for the car to push us out of the road and completely safe into a snow hill. I realized a bit later that a lamppost on the same side we flew off to had crushed the back right side of our car, just missing the angle that would have hit me. Years later, I realized the reason my dad sped up the vehicle. Getting hit by that car was a question of when, not if, and if he had not accelerated, that lamppost would have been my death. After that occurrence, my pulse always drops in pressure situations. I woke up from a deep sleep at like 2 a.m. during a winter storm. Something wasn't right. I immediately went looking for my senior dog and couldn't find her anywhere in the house. My roommates had a tendency to let her out for a walk and forget about her, closing the door. I ran to the front door of the house and found her laying on the welcome mat. She was hardly breathing and covered in snow. She had been outside alone for at the very least 5 hours. I moved out shortly after. Was sitting on one of those metal cylindrical electricity boxes outside my house when there was a blackout. Electricity was slightly flickering in my house. No other houses had a blackout. I looked down at what I was sitting on, and I was like, maybe this is the source of the problem. I stood up and stepped away from it, and like 2 seconds later, it freaking blew up. Like a pillar of flame shot out and above it for almost a full minute. It was basically a gigantic Bunsen burner, and I was a few seconds short of getting physically fried. When I was in college, I lived in a sketchy part of Chicago. I liked to take late-night strolls, even when I was living in that neighborhood as a 20-year-old woman. Yeah, I know, pretty dumb of me. One night, I was feeling stressed out, so I embarked on one of my late-night strolls. I was walking along a somewhat busy road. Cars were zooming past me, pretty normal. I wasn't paying much attention because I was too wrapped up in whatever was stressing me out that night. Suddenly, a chill shot up my spine, hypervigilance washed over me, and I became more alert than I ever had been. Something was wrong. Someone was watching me. I quickly spotted a car. It was driving in the opposite direction, a little slower than usual. It was too dark for me to see anyone inside the car, and the car was pretty unassuming, but I still knew something was off. They were watching me. I just knew. The car passed me and then made a U-turn. Now it was right behind me, creeping along the curb. Luckily, there was a Walgreens a few blocks ahead. I started walking faster, and the car eventually sped past me and disappeared into a corner. I somehow knew I wasn't safe yet, so I still sprinted to Walgreens. I told the security guard what had happened, and we both went outside. The car was parked up the street about 50 to 100 feet away. The security guard was a big guy who looked intimidating. He marched towards the car, and the car immediately backed up, made a U-turn, and then booked it out of there. The security guard called the cops, and they drove me home. I never took a late-night stroll again. My gut made me more alert, but it was really the security guard who saved my life. I'm positive that if he wasn't there that night, something bad would have happened to me. I wish I could find that security guard to thank him. Once I was at the bank doing business with the ATM, I noticed a black and yellow van parked with a man in the driver's seat. The van was off and he was just sitting there. Made me uncomfortable, so I didn't want to go home. Instead, I got in my car and moved to the other side of the parking lot near the hardware store and outdoor recycling center. It was broad daylight. I just sat in my car pretending to read, and the van started up and moved down to my side of the parking lot. Again, he reversed the van into a parking spot that was facing my car. Now, I knew that I shouldn't go home, which was nearby, so instead, I got out and went to visit the 2 men who were manning the recycling center. I asked if I could sit on their extra chair because the van guy was making me uncomfortable. They said sure, and since business was slow, we got to chatting. I asked them how they liked work and how business had been. The van guy finally started up his van and left. After, I took a picture of it and texted the info to my husband. After another 10 minutes with the guys, I took a circuitous route home to make sure the van wasn't anywhere around. The kicker is this. I asked the guys how long they'd been working at the recycling station, and they said about 4 months. I'm like, oh, what did you do before this? And they both go, oh, we were in prison before. Well, whatever, they still saved me.